the scent of damp earth, and the ghost of my wife's perfume, a delicate rosewater essence, were the only things that felt real anymore. It had been 6 months since Eleanor left. 6 months of a silence so profound it echoed in the empty rooms of our meticulously kept house. Our house, the one we'd built together, brick by loving brick, in the manicured embrace of Willow Creek Estates. And it was here, in this supposed sanctuary of suburban tranquility, that the first tremor of something truly unsettling began to crackle through the quiet. My roses. Eleanor's roses. They were her pride, her joy, her living legacy. She'd coaxed them from stubborn soil, nurtured them through harsh winters and scorching summers, and their vibrant blooms, a riot of crimson, blush pink, and creamy white, had been a constant, breathtaking testament to her passion. She'd spent countless hours in the garden, her hands stained with earth, her face alight with a satisfaction that radiated outwards. Now, those roses were all I had left of her tangible presence, their fragrance a bittersweet balm on my raw grief. The HOA, Willow Creek's self-appointed guardians of aesthetic perfection, was a constant, low-grade hum of annoyance in our lives, even when Eleanor was here. She'd navigated their petty regulations with a practiced sigh, a wry smile, and an unwavering commitment to her garden's natural, albeit spectacular, beauty. I, on the other hand, had always found their pronouncements more irritating than inspiring. But Eleanor had understood their role, their desire for uniformity. She'd always complied, albeit with a flourish of her own. My first inkling that something was amiss came on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were usually my quietest day. I'd take my morning coffee out to the back patio, the one Eleanor had designed with a perfect view of her rose garden, and just breathe. I'd let the morning sun warm my face, listen to the bird song, and feel a fragile sense of peace settle over me. But this Tuesday, the peace was shattered. The northwest corner of the garden, the one bordering the property of Mrs. Eleanor Vance, known universally, and with a palpable sense of dread as Karen, was bare. Not just a little bare, but starkly, brutally empty. The vibrant crimson peace roses, the ones Eleanor had babied the most, the ones that had bloomed with an almost defiant intensity, were gone. Vanished. Not a single petal, not a broken stem. It was as if they'd been surgically removed. My heart, already a fragile thing, lurched. My first thought was theft. But who would steal roses? And why those roses? They were magnificent, yes, but hardly the kind of thing one pilfers in the dead of night. Unless it was someone with a specific, malicious intent. I walked over to the fence, my footsteps heavy on the dew-kissed grass. The fence itself was a low, white picket affair, a token barrier that did little to deter the more determined squirrels, let alone a human. I peered over. Mrs. Vance's yard was a testament to all things beige and orderly. Perfectly manicured lawn, not a blade out of place, a manicured, lifeless expanse. Her own rose bushes were a muted, unassuming pink, meticulously pruned into identical spheres. Nothing like Eleanor's wild, exuberant explosions of color. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Mrs. Vance? Of course. She had always been possessive of her property, and it seemed deeply resentful of anything that dared to deviate from her own rigid definition of suburban perfection. Eleanor had once mentioned, with a sigh that carried more weariness than anger, that Mrs. Vance had complained about the overwhelming scent of Eleanor's roses drifting into her yard. Eleanor, ever the diplomat, had offered to trim them back. But Mrs. Vance had waved her away with a dismissive flick of her wrist, muttering something about standards. I felt a prickle of anger, a sensation I hadn't experienced with such intensity since Eleanor's illness had begun to steal her away. This wasn't just about roses. This was about Eleanor. It was a desecration of her memory, a blatant disregard for the love and care she had poured into this garden. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, checking the other rose bushes. Thankfully, they were all still there, their velvety petals unfurling in the morning light. But the gaping hole where the peace roses had stood was a constant, gnawing reminder. I decided to confront Mrs. Vance. It was a decision born of grief, anger, and a naive belief that reason could prevail. I walked across my lawn, the familiar path now feeling fraught with an unfamiliar tension. I reached her immaculately swept front porch and, with a deep breath, rang the doorbell. The chime was sharp, almost aggressive. A moment later, the door opened, revealing Mrs. Vance. She was a woman sculpted from sharp angles and tight smiles. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun. Her eyes, a pale, icy blue, scrutinized me from behind rimless glasses. She was wearing a crisp, floral print house dress, the kind that looked like it had never seen a speck of dirt. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I tried to keep my voice steady, to channel Eleanor's gentle diplomacy. "Mrs. Vance, I'm here to ask about my roses, the peace roses, in the northwest corner of my garden." Her icy blue eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Your roses?" she repeated, as if the concept were foreign. "Yes," I continued, my voice gaining a slight tremor. "They seem to have disappeared overnight, and I was hoping you might have seen something. Or perhaps you have some knowledge of their whereabouts?" She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like ice shards cracking. "Mr. Davies, I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. Your garden is your responsibility. Mine is mine." "But they were right there, Mrs. Vance. They were Eleanor's favorite. Someone must have taken them." And I thought, given the proximity, I trailed off, feeling foolish and increasingly angry. Her tight smile stretched a fraction, revealing a flash of teeth. Perhaps the neighborhood youth have developed a sudden taste for horticulture. Or perhaps... She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was anything but. Perhaps they simply weren't up to Willow Creek standards. A bit unruly, wouldn't you say? The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was admitting it, in her own roundabout, passive-aggressive way. She thought Eleanor's roses were an eyesore, a blight on her perfect little world, and she'd taken it upon herself to rectify the situation. My hands clenched into fists. "Mrs. Vance, those roses were my late wife's. They meant the world to her, and they mean the world to me. If you know anything about them, I implore you to tell me." Her gaze hardened. "Mr. Davies, I believe you are mistaken, and frankly, I find your insinuation rather offensive. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." She began to close the door, her movement decisive and final. I stood there for a moment, stunned, the absurdity of the situation washing over me. She had stolen Eleanor's roses, her precious legacy, and was now acting as if I were the one being unreasonable. Defeated, but not entirely without a flicker of righteous indignation, I turned and walked back towards my house. As I reached my porch, I glanced back at Mrs. Vance's house. The front door was closed, a solid, impenetrable barrier. But in her meticulously maintained window, I thought I saw a flash of crimson, a deep, vibrant crimson, the color of Eleanor's peace roses. The flash of crimson in Mrs. Vance's window was probably just a trick of the light, a reflection of the setting sun on some gaudy knick-knack. I told myself that as I walked back to my own immaculately swept patio, the gnawing suspicion in my gut refusing to be soothed. Eleanor's roses, gone. Not wilted, not diseased, but gone. Surgically removed, leaving behind only the ghost of their vibrant presence and the unnervingly tidy patch of earth where they had once bloomed. The HOA. That ever-present low-grade hum of annoyance that had amplified into a deafening roar in my life since Eleanor left. They were a committee of busybodies, empowered by covenants and bylaws to police our lawns, our paint colors, our very existence into a uniform, beige monotony. Mrs. Vance, the HOA president, was their undisputed queen. Her own rose bushes were a muted, unassuming pink, meticulously pruned into identical spheres. Nothing like Eleanor's wild, exuberant explosions of color. Eleanor had understood their role, their desire for uniformity, and had always kept them meticulously pruned, but she'd never sacrificed their spirit for the sake of the HOA's suffocating aesthetic. She'd coaxed them from stubborn soil, nurtured them with a devotion that was both beautiful and, I now realized, deeply vulnerable to the pettiness of people like Mrs. Vance. The scent of damp earth and the ghost of my wife's perfume, that delicate rosewater essence she always favored, were the only things that felt real anymore. The silence of the yard, usually a comforting balm, was now a gaping hole, a stark reminder of what was missing. I replayed the conversation with Mrs. Vance in my head. Her practiced sigh, the way she'd smoothed down her floral print house dress as if to physically erase any trace of impoliteness, her voice a clipped, precise instrument, devoid of warmth. "Mistaken, Mr. Davies," she'd said, her icy blue eyes behind rimless glasses never quite meeting mine. "My roses are perfectly in line with Willow Creek standards. Yours, while I appreciate the effort, tend to be a bit unruly. Perhaps yours simply didn't survive the season." She hadn't admitted to anything, not directly. But the insinuation was as clear as the sharp angles of her face. Eleanor's roses were an eyesore, a blight on her meticulously maintained vision of suburban perfection, and she had simply rectified the problem. The thought curdled in my stomach. It wasn't just about roses. It was about Eleanor. It was about her legacy, her passion, the vibrant life she had poured into that garden. To pilfer them, to steal them under the cover of darkness and then feign ignorance with such chilling composure, it spoke of a malicious intent that went far beyond neighborhood disputes. I needed proof, something tangible. The flash of crimson in her window was a sliver of hope, a fragile thread to pull. But how to get it without causing a scene, without further escalating this already fraught situation? The HOA was a powerful entity, and Mrs. Vance wielded its authority like a cudgel. I was a grieving widower, not a litigious warrior. The next morning, the dew-kissed grass felt unusually damp under my feet as I stepped out onto the patio, the morning sun warm on my face. The birdsong, usually a cheerful symphony, seemed muted, overshadowed by the unsettling quiet in the northwest corner of my yard. I walked towards the empty space, my hands stained with earth from an earlier, futile attempt to replant some hostas. The soil was still disturbed, a raw wound in the otherwise orderly landscape. As I stood there, a glint of red caught my eye, not in Mrs. Vance's window this time, but on her side of the fence, tucked away near a particularly aggressive-looking azalea. It was a single, vibrant crimson petal. Eleanor's crimson peace rose petal. It hadn't been swept away, hadn't been neatly discarded. It was just there. A defiant splash of color against the muted tones of her yard. A surge of something akin to righteous indignation coursed through me. This wasn't a mistake. This was a taunt. She had taken them, and now she was leaving a single petal as a monument to her victory. I remembered Eleanor's gentle diplomacy, her ability to navigate the HOA's labyrinthine rules with a smile and a well-placed compliment. She'd always said, "You catch more flies with honey, Arthur, than with vinegar." I, however, was fresh out of honey. My resolve hardened. I couldn't let this stand. I couldn't let Eleanor's memory be desecrated by such petty theft and cold-hearted denial. I needed to confront her again, but this time, I wouldn't be going in with mere suspicion. I had a piece of evidence, albeit small. I walked to the fence, a token barrier that now felt more like a prison wall. I could see the edge of her prize-winning petunias, a perfect wave of purple and white, as meticulously arranged as soldiers on parade. Then I saw it. Just beyond the petunias, nestled in a decorative ceramic pot on her patio, was a cluster of crimson blooms. Not one or two, but a full, breathtaking bouquet. Eleanor's peace roses. They were unmistakably hers. Their unique shade of crimson, the delicate cupping of their petals, even the way they seemed to lean towards the sun. My heart hammered against my ribs. The audacity, the sheer, unadulterated gall. She had stolen them, brought them into her own yard, and displayed them as if they were her own trophies. The flash of crimson in the window hadn't been a trick of the light. It had been the bouquet, proudly displayed. I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to channel Eleanor's calm. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't accuse her wildly. I would be firm. I would be decisive. I walked around to her front door, the polished brass knocker gleaming under the morning sun. I hesitated for a moment, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. This was no longer just about roses. It was about justice, however small, for Eleanor. I raised the knocker and let it fall, the sharp, almost aggressive chime echoing through the unnervingly quiet street. The door opened almost instantly, revealing Mrs. Vance, dressed in a crisp, pale blue cardigan that did little to soften the severe lines of her jaw. Her expression was one of mild, almost weary annoyance. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice lacking any genuine warmth. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" "Mrs. Vance," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt deep within. "I believe you have something of mine, something that belonged to my late wife." Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "My roses," I said, my gaze flicking past her, towards the patio where the crimson blooms were now impossible to ignore. Eleanor's peace roses. The ones that were in the northwest corner of my garden. "I saw them, Mrs. Vance, on your patio. In that pot." Her face remained impassive for a beat, a carefully blank mask. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible smile spread across her lips. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of someone who had been caught, but was about to turn the tables. "Ah, yes," she said, her voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper that was anything but. "Those roses, I was wondering when you'd notice. They were quite an eyesore, weren't they? Such an unruly proliferation of color, so out of keeping with the established aesthetic of Willow Creek Estates." She stepped aside, gesturing me into her impeccably decorated living room. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and something vaguely floral, but not roses. It was a sterile, controlled scent. "You see, Mr. Davies?" she continued, closing the door behind me with a soft click. While Eleanor may have had a certain knack for horticulture, she didn't always adhere to the community's standards. Those particular bushes had become rather aggressive. They were encroaching on my property line, and frankly, their vibrant hues were rather distracting. I believe my adherence to the HOA's guidelines is a testament to my commitment to our shared community. I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides. Her words were a carefully constructed edifice of passive aggression, each syllable designed to undermine and dismiss. She hadn't admitted to stealing. Not directly, but the implication was clear. She had taken them because they offended her sense of order. "You stole them," I stated, my voice low and dangerous. "Under the cover of darkness, you trespassed onto my property and cut down my wife's roses." She laughed, a short, sharp sound like ice shards cracking. "Trespass, Mr. Davies? A rather strong accusation. I merely, relocated them to a more appropriate setting. And besides," she added, her icy blue eyes narrowing, "they were technically on the border. A shared space, one might say. And if something is an eyesore, it is the responsibility of the homeowner to rectify the situation, especially when the HOA standards are being challenged." My mind raced. She was playing a game, a twisted legalistic game of semantics. But the visual evidence was undeniable, the crimson roses blooming defiantly in her pot. "I want them back, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice gaining an edge of steel. "Now." She tilted her head, a look of mock sympathy on her face. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Davies. As I said, they are now part of my garden's aesthetic. And frankly, they are far too beautiful to be allowed to languish in a state of disarray. I have plans for them." The frustration, the raw grief, the simmering anger of the past 6 months coalesced into a single, determined point. I couldn't win this by appealing to her sense of fairness, because she clearly had none. I needed to play a different game. "Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice suddenly calm, almost unnervingly so. "You seem to misunderstand the situation. This isn't a matter of neighborhood aesthetics or HOA guidelines. This is a matter of theft and trespass. And I have proof." Her practiced smile faltered. A flicker of something. Annoyance? Fear? Crossed her face. "Proof? What proof could you possibly have?" "The petal," I said, my gaze steady. "I found a petal from Eleanor's roses on your side of the fence this morning, and I saw the bouquet on your patio. The evidence is rather damning, wouldn't you agree?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I continued, my voice gaining momentum. "I was about to call the sheriff. I was going to report the theft of my property. But then I thought, perhaps we could avoid all that unpleasantness. Perhaps you could simply return what you took. But since you refuse, I suppose I have no choice." I pulled out my phone, my fingers already dialing the non-emergency police number. Her eyes widened, a genuine shock replacing her carefully constructed composure. "You wouldn't," she breathed, her voice losing its clipped precision. "I would, Mrs. Vance," I said, my thumb hovering over the call button. "For Eleanor, for her roses, for the respect she deserves." She stared at me, her face a mask of dawning horror. The immaculate order of her world was beginning to crack. "The sheriff will need to see the roses, of course," I added, my gaze meeting hers directly. "And they'll need to hear your explanation for why they were in your possession and why they were taken from my property." Her well-ordered universe seemed to crumble around her. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly frail, her sharp angles softened by a genuine fear. She stammered, But they're mine now. I cultivated them." "You stole them," I repeated, the words a stark, brutal truth. She wrung her hands, her gaze darting from me to the roses on her patio, then back again. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of her transgression. Finally, with a defeated sigh that was worlds away from her earlier practiced one, she turned, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Fine, you win. Just don't involve the sheriff, please." She walked towards the patio, her movements stiff and reluctant, She carefully gathered the bouquet, her hands trembling slightly, and brought them inside. The scent of Eleanor's roses, muted by the sterile air of Mrs. Vance's home, felt like a victory, but a hollow one. When she returned, the crimson blooms were clutched in her hands, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to her ashen face. She held them out to me, her eyes downcast, avoiding my gaze. "Here," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "Take them!" I took the roses, their familiar fragrance filling my lungs. It was a bittersweet balm on my raw grief, a tangible piece of Eleanor returned to me. The knot of unease in my stomach began to loosen, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice softer now. "I believe this is the end of our conversation." I turned and walked away, the stolen roses held carefully in my arms. As I reached my own yard, I glanced back. Mrs. Vance stood on her porch, a solitary figure against the backdrop of her perfectly manicured lawn, her face a study in defeat. The sheriff had not been needed, but Mrs. Vance, the queen of Willow Creek Estates, had been brought low by a few stolen roses. And for Eleanor, I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The damp, earthy scent of Eleanor's roses, once a bittersweet balm on my raw grief, now felt like a heavy shroud. I cradled the bouquet, their crimson petals still dewy, a stark contrast to the brittle, dried-out husks I'd seen on Mrs. Vance's patio. It was a small victory, reclaiming these vibrant remnants of my wife. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the sheer pettiness of the act. Mrs. Vance, the self-appointed arbiter of Willow Creek Estate's pristine image, had pilfered a piece of my soul. I retreated into my house, closing the door on the carefully manicured, yet eerily silent street. The roses, Eleanor's peace roses, were a riot of crimson, blush pink, and creamy white. She'd coaxed them from stubborn soil, nurtured them with a patience I'd always admired, and their vibrant blooms had been a constant, breathtaking testament to her passion. Now, they were all I had left of her tangible presence, a fragrant echo in a house that had grown too large, too quiet. My hands, still stained with earth from the brief, tense exchange with Mrs. Vance, trembled slightly as I arranged the bouquet in a crystal vase. It had been Eleanor's favorite, a delicate thing that caught the light and seemed to amplify the rose's already magnificent hue. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once been a comforting rhythm, but now felt like a relentless countdown to what? More of this? More of the suffocating conformity that Mrs. Vance championed? I sank into the armchair by the window, the one Eleanor had always claimed as hers. The afternoon sun, warm and golden, slanted across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It was a peaceful scene, the kind that should have soothed the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in my gut. But the peace felt fragile, a thin veneer over an unsettling truth, that even within the supposed sanctuary of suburban tranquility, there were those who would trespass, who would diminish, who would steal. I thought back to the moment Sheriff Brody had arrived. His presence had been a stark contrast to the usual hushed tones of Willow Creek. The crackle of his radio, the solid click of his boots on my porch, had cut through the oppressive quiet like a sharp, unexpected note. He'd listened patiently, his gaze steady, as I recounted the theft. He hadn't dismissed my grief, hadn't implied that stolen roses were a trivial matter. He'd seen the hurt in my eyes, the raw anger simmering beneath the surface, and he'd met Mrs. Vance with a quiet authority that had clearly unnerved her. When he'd read her the trespassing warrant, the air had crackled with a different kind of tension. Mrs. Vance, usually so composed, so in control, had visibly deflated. Her meticulously sculpted composure had fractured, revealing a flicker of panic. I'd watched, a grim satisfaction settling over me as her icy blue eyes widened behind her rimless glasses. Her perfectly coiffed hair, usually a severe bun, seemed to loosen its grip. She'd stammered, her clipped, precise voice losing its edge. I don't understand. They were an eyesore. An eyesore. Eleanor's roses. The very thought sent a fresh wave of indignation through me. Eleanor had understood their role, their desire for uniformity. Her roses, with their wild, exuberant bursts of color, had been a deliberate, beautiful defiance of the sterile perfection that Mrs. Vance seemed to crave. They were a testament to life, to passion, to a spirit that refused to be contained within the beige boxes of Willow Creek. Sheriff Brody had held up one of Eleanor's crimson petals, still clinging stubbornly to the hem of Mrs. Vance's crisp, floral print house dress. "Ma'am," he'd said, his voice devoid of warmth, "Mr. Davies has reported his wife's prize roses stolen. We found these on your property, along with the bouquet on your patio. This constitutes trespassing and theft." Mrs. Vance had blinked, a slow, deliberate movement that suggested she was trying to process a foreign concept. "But they were encroaching," she'd finally managed, her voice a thin, reedy sound. "Their scent was overwhelming. It's a violation of community standards." "Community standards, ma'am," Sheriff Brody had replied, his tone flat, "do not include the theft of personal property. Mr. Davies here is understandably upset. He's been through a great deal recently." He'd glanced at me, a subtle nod of understanding. He just wants his wife's legacy back. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Mrs. Vance's face had flushed a faint, mottled red. She'd opened her mouth as if to protest, then closed it, her jaw working silently. The carefully constructed facade had crumbled completely. She'd finally, grudgingly, agreed to return the roses, her movements stiff and robotic as she retrieved the bouquet from her patio. Now, sitting in my living room, the scent of Eleanor's roses filling the air, I felt a strange mix of relief and weariness. The immediate crisis was over. The roses were back. But the underlying rot, the petty tyranny of the HOA and its enforcers, remained. Mrs. Vance was still my neighbor. She was still the president of the HOA. And her icy blue eyes, I suspected, would watch my every move, searching for any deviation, any imperfection, any excuse to exert her authority. I picked up a single rose, its velvety petals cool against my fingertips. I remembered Eleanor's hands, perpetually stained with earth, gently coaxing new life from the soil. She'd had a way of making things grow, of coaxing beauty from the most unlikely places. She'd understood that true beauty often lay in the wild, the exuberant, the untamed. It was a lesson that Mrs. Vance, with her rigid adherence to uniformity, seemed incapable of grasping. The HOA, with its endless regulations and its pursuit of sterile perfection, had always been a low-grade hum of annoyance in my life. It had been a constant, irritating reminder of the pressure to conform, to blend in. But Eleanor had navigated it with a grace and diplomacy that had always impressed me. She'd found ways to express her vibrant spirit within the confines of the rules. Her garden a testament to her ability to create beauty even within a system that seemed designed to stifle it. Now, without her, that same system felt more oppressive than ever. The loss of her roses had been a brutal, tangible blow. It had felt like a personal attack, a desecration of her memory. And the fact that it had been Mrs. Vance, the embodiment of everything Eleanor had subtly resisted, made it all the more galling. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure Eleanor's smile, her gentle laughter. I could almost hear her voice, a soft murmur of encouragement. telling me not to let the small things get me down. But this wasn't a small thing. This was about respect. This was about memory. This was about the enduring power of love, even in the face of petty malice. A faint scent, not of roses, but of something sharp and chemical, wafted in from outside. It was the scent of Mrs. Vance's industrial-strength weed killer, no doubt being applied with the same aggressive precision she applied to everything else. I sighed, a long, slow exhalation. The peace was shattered. The quiet had been replaced by a gnawing awareness of the absurdity of it all. I knew this wasn't the end of it. Mrs. Vance, humbled but not defeated, would likely find some other way to assert her dominance, some other petty grievance to pursue. The roses were back, but the war for my garden, for Eleanor's legacy, felt like it had just begun. I looked at the crimson blooms, their vibrant color a defiant splash against the muted tones of my grief. They were a reminder of what I was fighting for. They were a testament to Eleanor's spirit, a spirit that, unlike Mrs. Vance's rigid order, would never truly be contained. And I, Arthur Davies, widower and reluctant warrior, would do my best to keep that spirit alive, one defiant bloom at a time. The thought, as I looked at the roses, sparked a flicker of something akin to resolve, a quiet determination that began to push back against the heavy shroud of grief. I would tend to Eleanor's garden. I would honor her legacy. And if Mrs. Vance dared to cross that line again, she would find that the quiet widower had a capacity for righteous indignation she hadn't anticipated. The crimson blooms, once a vibrant testament to Eleanor's passion, now sat in a chipped terracotta pot on my patio table, their petals already beginning to droop. They were a hollow victory, a symbol of desecration rather than a revival of beauty. Mrs. Vance had returned them, yes, but the act felt more like a reluctant surrender than an apology. The smug, tight-lipped expression on her face as she'd thrust the pot into my hands had spoken volumes. It was a look that said, "This is a temporary truce, Davies, but the war is far from over." And she was right. The peace we'd once shared, or at least tolerated, in Willow Creek Estates had been irrevocably shattered. The air, once filled with the gentle murmur of lawn mowers and the distant laughter of children, now felt charged with an unfamiliar tension. Every rustle of leaves, every sharp chime of a passing golf cart seemed to prickle my nerves. I found myself watching Mrs. Vance's immaculate house, its beige facade a stark contrast to the vibrant life Eleanor had cultivated next door, with a gnawing unease. Her perfectly manicured lawn, her symmetrically pruned bushes, they were a visual representation of her mind, I suspected, devoid of any spontaneity, any hint of wildness. I spent the next few days meticulously tending to Eleanor's roses. I repotted them, carefully examining each stem, each leaf, for any sign of damage beyond the brutal theft. The cuts were clean, almost surgical, a detail that still unsettled me. It wasn't the clumsy work of a vandal. It was the deliberate act of someone who knew what they were doing, someone who wanted to inflict maximum damage while appearing to be merely tidying up. I watered them, spoke to them as if Eleanor were listening, my voice a low rumble against the backdrop of the quiet neighborhood. The scent of damp earth and the ghost of Eleanor's perfume, a delicate rosewater essence, were the only things that felt real anymore. The silence in the house was profound, echoing with the absence of her laughter, her humming, the gentle clinking of her gardening tools. The HOA, with its endless rules and regulations, had always been a low-grade hum of annoyance, a constant reminder of the conformity Eleanor had often chafed against. But I'd never truly felt its oppressive weight until now. Now, it felt like a suffocating blanket, and Mrs. Vance, its self-appointed queen, was the architect of its suffocating grip. I tried to focus on the present, on rebuilding what had been so carelessly dismantled. I pruned away the damaged stems, the ones Mrs. Vance's secateurs had unforgivingly lopped off. It felt like performing surgery on a piece of Eleanor's soul, each snip of the shears a fresh stab of grief. The vibrant crimson blooms, which had been her pride, her joy, her living legacy, were now a source of profound sadness. They were all I had left of her tangible presence, and they had been pilfered, defiled, and returned with a sneer. One afternoon, as I was carefully deadheading a particularly robust cluster of Queen Elizabeth roses, a sharp, almost aggressive chime cut through the quiet. It was the HOA's official notification bell, a device installed on every doorstep, designed to announce the arrival of directives, warnings, or more often than not, complaints. My heart sank. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, who had sent it. I walked to the front door, my hand still stained with earth, and opened it to find Mrs. Vance standing on my porch, her posture ramrod straight, her expression one of practiced disapproval. She was a woman sculpted from sharp angles and tight smiles. Her severe bun pulled so taut, it seemed to stretch the skin across her forehead. Her icy blue eyes, magnified behind rimless glasses, surveyed my porch, my house, and finally me, with an unnerving intensity. She wore a crisp, floral print house dress, the kind that implied a certain domesticity, but her demeanor was anything but warm. "Mr. Davies," she began, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth, like ice shards cracking. "I trust you received the notification." I nodded, clutching the notification slip. It was a formal warning, printed on official HOA letterhead, detailing a violation of Section 7, subsection B of the Willow Creek Estates Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, unauthorized alteration of landscaping and removal of approved flora. The audacity of it made my blood boil. She had stolen Eleanor's roses, and now she was citing me for a violation. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice steady, though a slight tremor betrayed the anger simmering beneath the surface. "These roses are my late wife's. They were here long before your interpretations of the rules." She gave a short, sharp laugh, a sound that was utterly devoid of humor. "My interpretations, Mr. Davies, are the rules, and your roses, as you so fondly call them, have become an eyesore. They have encroached upon the common area, and frankly, their exuberance is a blight upon the aesthetic standards of Willow Creek Estates." "Encroached?" I repeated, incredulous. Eleanor's rose bushes, vibrant and overflowing, had been the very definition of beauty in this sterile landscape. They had bloomed with an almost defiant intensity, a stark contrast to the muted, unassuming pink roses Mrs. Vance meticulously pruned into identical spheres next door. "They are on my property, Mrs. Vance." "They have always been on my property." "That is precisely the point," she countered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was anything but. "Their uncontrolled growth is a clear disregard for the uniformity we strive for. And their removal, while perhaps regrettable, was a necessary step to rectify the situation. It was a matter of horticultural responsibility." "Horticultural responsibility?" She spoke as if she were conducting a scientific experiment, not as if she had ripped the heart out of my garden and my grief. "You stole them, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice hardening. "You didn't rectify anything. You committed theft, and now you're trying to cover it up with your ridiculous HOA jargon." Her icy blue eyes narrowed. "I am the president of this HOA, Mr. Davies. My decisions are final, and I assure you, any further attempts to defy the established standards will be met with more decisive action." She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that felt like a dismissal. The sheriff will be notified if these violations persist. She turned on her heel, her floral print house dress swishing crisply, and walked away, leaving me standing on my porch. The notification slip a heavy weight in my hand. The sheriff. She was threatening to involve the sheriff. The absurdity of it all threatened to overwhelm me. She, the perpetrator, was threatening to call the authorities on me, the victim. That night, sleep eluded me. The image of Mrs. Vance's face, her cold, unyielding expression, was seared into my mind. I thought about Eleanor, about her unwavering commitment to her garden, about the joy she found in coaxing life from the earth. I thought about the quiet dignity with which she had navigated the petty tyrannies of the HOA, always trying to find a diplomatic solution, always seeking to maintain peace. But peace, it seemed, was a fragile thing in Willow Creek Estates. The next morning, the early sun was warm on my face as I sat on my back patio, a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hands. The roses, despite their wilting state, still held a certain majesty. I knew I couldn't let Mrs. Vance win. I owed it to Eleanor. I owed it to myself. The notification was a threat, a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate me into submission. But I wouldn't be intimidated. A prickle of an idea, a spark of righteous indignation began to glow within me. If Mrs. Vance was going to play by the HOA's rules, then I would too. But I would play them in a way she never expected. I would expose her for what she truly was, a petty tyrant hiding behind a veneer of order. I stood up and walked towards the fence that separated my property from Mrs. Vance's. Her yard was a monument to uniformity, a lifeless expanse of perfectly manicured lawn and symmetrically sculpted hedges. Her own roses, a muted, unassuming pink, were pruned into identical spheres, as if they were afraid to offend. I remembered Eleanor's words, spoken years ago during one of Mrs. Vance's particularly zealous HOA meetings. "Arthur," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm, "some people find comfort in order. They fear anything that deviates from the norm. It's not about malice, necessarily. It's about fear." I had dismissed it then, seeing only Mrs. Vance's aggressive posturing. But now, looking at her rigid, lifeless garden, I wondered if Eleanor had been right. Perhaps Mrs. Vance's actions weren't purely malicious, but born of a deep-seated insecurity, a desperate need to control the uncontrollable. Still, fear or not, theft was theft, and threatening me with the sheriff was a line that could not be uncrossed. I picked up my phone and dialed. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't call the police. I called a name Eleanor had sometimes mentioned with a wry smile, a name that represented a different kind of authority, a different kind of justice. I called Sheriff Brody. I explained the situation, my voice calm and measured, detailing the theft, the confrontation, the returned roses, and now, the official HOA warning. Sheriff Brody listened patiently, his voice a low, steady rumble on the other end of the line. He knew Eleanor, had often stopped by to admire her garden. He understood the sentimentality, the significance of those roses. "Mr. Davies," he said finally, his tone grave, "I understand your frustration, and I want to assure you, we take matters of theft and harassment very seriously. Mrs. Vance has the right to enforce HOA regulations, but she does not have the right to steal your property. I'll pay her a visit. We'll have a little chat about the nuances of trespassing and property rights." A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made my knees buckle. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about restoring a semblance of balance, about reminding Mrs. Vance that there were boundaries, even in Willow Creek Estates. About an hour later, A sheriff's patrol car, its lights off but its presence undeniable, pulled into Mrs. Vance's driveway. I watched from my patio, a faint smile playing on my lips. I saw Sheriff Brody emerge from the car, a tall, imposing figure, and walk purposefully towards Mrs. Vance's front door. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could imagine the scene. Mrs. Vance no doubt would attempt her usual sharp, clipped pronouncements, her practiced air of superiority. But Sheriff Brody was not an HOA member. He was a man of the law, and he understood the difference between enforcing rules and committing crimes. Minutes later, I saw Mrs. Vance emerge from her house, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. Sheriff Brody was speaking to her, his hand resting on a document he'd pulled from his pocket. I saw her eyes widen, her mouth form a silent O of shock. He was reading her the trespassing warrant, the warrant for her arrest, for entering my property and stealing my roses. She froze, her impeccably sculpted composure shattering like fragile glass. Her face, usually so stern and unyielding, contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. She stammered, gestured wildly, her voice, for the first time, losing its sharp edge, replaced by a shrill, desperate plea. Sheriff Brody, however, remained immovable, his gaze steady, his words clear. He was reading her the warrant, detailing her trespass, her theft, and the consequences. The carefully maintained order of Mrs. Vance's world had just been brutally, irrevocably disrupted. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something akin to peace. Eleanor's roses, though bruised, would be safe. And Mrs. Vance, the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek Estates, would finally face the consequences of her actions. The scent of damp earth and the ghost of Eleanor's perfume, a delicate rosewater essence, were the only things that felt real anymore. The crimson blooms, once a vibrant testament to her passion, now sat in a chipped terracotta pot on my patio table, their petals beginning to droop. Mrs. Vance had returned them, yes, but the act felt more like a reluctant surrender than an apology. The smug, tight-lipped expression on her face as she'd thrust the pot into my hands had spoken volumes. This is a temporary truce, Davies, but the war is far from over. And she was right. The carefully curated peace of Willow Creek Estates had been irrevocably shattered. The air, once filled with the gentle murmur of lawnmowers and the distant laughter of children, now felt charged with an unfamiliar tension. Every rustle of leaves, every sharp chime of a passing golf cart seemed to prickle my nerves. I found myself watching Mrs. Vance's immaculate house, its beige facade a stark contrast to the vibrant life Eleanor had cultivated next door, with a gnawing unease. Her perfectly manicured lawn, her symmetrically pruned bushes. They were a visual representation of her mind, I suspected, devoid of any spontaneity, any hint of wildness. I spent the next few days meticulously tending to Eleanor's roses, repotting them, examining each stem, each leaf, for any sign of damage beyond the brutal theft. The cuts were clean, almost surgical, a detail that still unsettled me. It wasn't the clumsy work of a vandal. It was the deliberate act of someone who knew what they were doing, someone who wanted to inflict maximum damage while appearing to be merely tidying up. I watered them, spoke to them as if Eleanor were listening, my voice a low rumble against the backdrop of the quiet neighborhood. The silence in the house was profound, echoing with the absence of her laughter, her humming, the gentle clinking of her gardening tools. The HOA, with its endless rules and regulations, had always been a low-grade hum of annoyance, a constant reminder of the conformity Eleanor had often chafed against. But I'd never truly felt its oppressive weight until now. Now it felt like a suffocating blanket, and Mrs. Vance, its self-appointed queen, was the architect of its suffocating grip. I pruned away the damaged stems, the ones Mrs. Vance's secateurs had unforgivingly lopped off. It felt like performing surgery on a piece of Eleanor's soul, each snip of the shears a fresh stab of grief. The vibrant crimson blooms, which had been her pride, her joy, her living legacy, were now a source of profound sadness. They were all I had left of her tangible presence. And they had been pilfered, defiled, and returned with a sneer. Then, one afternoon, as I was carefully deadheading a particularly robust cluster of Queen Elizabeth roses, a sharp, almost aggressive chime cut through the quiet. It was the HOA's official notification bell, a device installed on every doorstep, designed to announce the arrival of directives, warnings, or, more often than not, complaints. My heart sank. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, who had sent it. I walked to the front door, my hand still stained with earth, and opened it to find Mrs. Vance standing on my porch, her posture ramrod straight, her expression one of practiced disapproval. She was a woman sculpted from sharp angles and tight smiles, her severe bun pulled so taut it seemed to stretch the skin across her forehead. Her icy blue eyes, magnified behind rimless glasses, surveyed my porch, my house, and finally, me, with an unnerving intensity. She wore a crisp, floral print house dress, the kind that implied a certain domesticity, but her demeanor was anything but warm. "Mr. Davies?" she began, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth, like ice shards cracking. "I trust you received the notification." I nodded, clutching the notification slip. It was a formal warning, printed on official HOA letterhead, detailing a violation of Section 7, subsection B of the Willow Creek Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Unauthorized alteration of landscaping and removal of approved flora. The audacity of it made my blood boil. She had stolen Eleanor's roses, and now she was citing me for a violation. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice steady, though a slight tremor betrayed the anger simmering beneath the surface. "These roses are my late wife's. They were here long before your interpretations of the rules." She gave a short, sharp laugh,